Elon Musk has been talking about universal high income, but whenever he's asked about how to fund it, he usually just says something like, we should do a VAT tax. But what if I told you that I actually figured out how to build universal high income? Let's get into it. Now, I built this simulator, this UHI simulator, based on all the research that I've done for post-labor economics. And while it is, kind of a nice little rainbow and it might not make much sense to you, we will get through all the details. But what I want to point out is that when you actually stack an entire portfolio of different sources of income, whether it is a sovereign wealth fund, whether it is a UBI or baby bonds, all kinds of things can stack together, and eventually we will have much higher household income than we have today. That is the core insight. So universal high income is basically anything that you can do that is non-wage, non-labor based, that creates much higher income than we have today. So today, the median household income is $83,000 a year. So that's the baseline. So we want to get above that. Now, this big blue wedge that's declining, that is wages. So in this simulation, we say wages are going down. So how do we replace it? And so we replace it with a combination of universal basic income, sovereign dividends, and that sort of thing. And you see that in the long run, by 2060, we could more than double the median household income in today's dollars. So let's get into it and let's go through the entire presentation. I kind of arbitrarily set the goal for universal high income at $300,000 per year per household as the median income. So that was the goal. So let's now unpack how we actually get there. The first thing that you need to know is that over the long run, we have been invalidating wage labor. So there are three primary economic sectors. So there's the primary or extraction sector. That has gone from 80+% of the workforce down to less than 2% today. Then the secondary or manufacturing economy peaked at about 35% in the mid-20th century, and it's now down to 12% today. The tertiary sector or the services sector now constitutes 65 to 70% of the economy. And I also hear you, if you're adding up the math and you say the primary sector is 2% and secondary is 12%, that leaves that's only 14% total, which leaves 86%. So it does depend on how you measure this. But suffice to say, the vast majority of the economy today is in the tertiary sector, but there is no quaternary sector to migrate to. So this is the terminus of human wage labor. And if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that my mantra is better, faster, cheaper, and safer. Every time machines become better, faster, cheaper, and safer than humans, you end up with this labor migration. There is nowhere else for labor to migrate to, however. So then when you say, okay, well, what's the big problem? And this is where we actually start to identify the solution space as well, because the previous slide basically just shows, yes, we don't have anywhere for work to go, but what is actually kind of the problem? And when you say like, okay, this is the cycle, so that you have business revenues that pays wages, that allows workers to spend, and the workers buy products and services from businesses, and so the loop continues. However, if businesses stop paying wages, then you have what's called a deflationary death spiral. And this is really bad for the economy for a number of reasons. Consumer spending drives about 70% of GDP, and then also income and payroll taxes account for 80 to 85% of federal revenue. So the entire economy, and this is whether or not you are a citizen, whether or not you're an elite or a billionaire, or whether or not you're the government, the entire system is predicated on wage labor and wage taxes. So the capital owners don't need employees, they have machines, but they desperately need customers. An economy that automates away its consumers commits fiscal suicide. So that's where we're at. Now, the source of household income, because if household income is so important, we need to then break down and say, where does household income come from? So the three buckets are wages, capital, and transfers. That's it. Every dollar of household income and household spending comes from one of those three sources. Now, as we just established today, most of that comes from wages. So that's, what you're paid sourly. That's what you're paid on salary or hourly. There we go. That was a Spoonerism. So salary or hourly, self-employment, freelance, and that sort of stuff. Anything that comes from exchanging your time and energy for money, usually to enrich someone else. And then there's capital. So this is dividends, interest, rent, royalties, capital gains, and that sort of thing. And actually, since I just did my taxes, I learned an interesting thing. Technically, the money that I make from YouTube videos is a royalty. So a good chunk of my income comes from capital, even though I have to put it in. But the way that it's reported to taxes is any ad revenue from YouTube is a royalty. Yeah, go figure. So that's just an example. Then transfers. So transfers is anything the rule of thumb is that a transfer is that the government cuts you a check. So Social Security, tax credits, UBI, food assistance, housing subsidies, public health care, that sort of stuff. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that not all transfers are cash directly. There is another kind of transfer that's called an in-kind service, where basically you get something for free, or at no direct expense to you, that is defrayed by the government, and so that is still your effective household income. So if you have children going to public school, if you're using public roads, if you're using public transit, that is considered an in-kind transfer. So that's how that's tracked. And not every country tracks it that well, but every dollar that you spend that drives the economy comes from these three buckets, and wages are by far the largest bucket right now. And so then one thing to keep in mind is that as wages go away, capital and transfers must pick up the slack. That's the whole kit and caboodle of post-labor economics is if wages go away, you have to replace it with capital and transfers. And that is what universal high income is going to be comprised of. So, and I know it probably felt like a little bit of a detour, but here we are. So capital and transfers must replace wage-based income. That's the whole picture. So let's get into it. Median household income runs on one engine, and that engine is stalling. So when people ask for evidence, say, jobs, technology always creates new jobs. My assertion is that post-labor economics began in about the 70s. So when we see that labor share of national income was about 65%, and now it's down to about 56 to 58%. And by the way, it's not just America that it's declining in. Labor share of national income is declining in 13 out of 16 major economies since the 1980s. So basically that means that capital is eating labor. And when we say capital is eating labor, that means that the returns on capital have been increasing over time, which means that less and less income that the economy generates actually goes to wages. The second macroeconomic trend is the productivity versus wage gap. So productivity and wages grew in lockstep since 1948 to 1973, then diverged sharply. Productivity doubled, median compensation grew at a fraction of that rate. This is what you expect to see in an automated economy. One thing to keep in mind is that automation did not begin with large language models. Automation began with industrialization, with industrial robots, with databases and robotic process automation and back office automation. And then the other thing is that transfer dependence is rising. So government transfers as a share of personal income grew from 8% in 1970 to 18% in 2022. And it's actually much higher in more socialized nations like Norway and Germany. The fiscal system is already compensating for labor market failure. So this is what I mean when I say post-labor economics started a long time ago. So this breakdown right here, the 83,730 median household income for America, is about 82% wages, and then 13% transfers and 5% capital. Now that's median, so that's not any one single household. That's just kind of a snapshot of the whole economy. What we want to do is, as wages shrink, we want to grow above all, we want to grow the capital band. And ideally, transfers don't grow as much, but based on the math and number and simulations that I've done, it will need to grow quite a bit. So universal high income isn't one program, it's multiple income streams across three buckets. So we'll always have some residual wages, as I've talked about extensively. On the demand side, there's always going to be some demand for human touch. Now, does that mean everyone's going to be a content creator or a massage therapist? No. That's why it's called post-labor economics, is because labor is the centerpiece of the economy today, and it will not be tomorrow. So we've broken it down into, I've got 12 different buckets here. And this is not all of the buckets, by the way, but we have public capital at the national level. So that's a sovereign wealth fund. Then we have public capital at a state level, which is something like Alaska's permanent fund. Then there's public capital at the city level. So that's what's called an urban wealth fund or a municipal wealth fund. Then you have private wealth. So this is things such as ESOPs, EOTs. So an EOT is an employee ownership trust, which is very popular in England right now. And then you have cooperatives and that sort of thing. Then you also have new kinds of private wealth, such as DAOs. So that's a decentralized autonomous organization. Those are slowly becoming legal in various states and nations around the world. And then you have other private investment returns, such as stocks, bonds, dividends, rental properties, and that sort of thing. So that's all the capital options. And then we have here more transfer options. So you could have a UBI, a national UBI. You can also have a state UBI and a municipal UBI, meaning that you might be getting universal basic income from several sources, just in the same way that you might be getting dividends from several capital funds, several public capital funds. Then you have conventional social insurance, such as Social Security and Medicare, baby bonds, which are actually being implemented as we speak, carbon rebates and other commons dividends. So a commons dividend is basically the government auctions off spectrum, and instead of that just being folded into the government budget, a commons dividend basically says you actually, as a member, as a citizen of the nation that is auctioning off that spectrum, you are entitled to a cut of that. And so that dividend can either go directly to households or it can capitalize the capital funds over here, the endowments. So this is just an example of what you actually compose UHI of. Now, what you might notice is missing here is any talk of VAT taxes or wealth taxes or that sort of thing. VAT taxes and wealth taxes or robot taxes or automation taxes, those can be discussed as how you fund each of these individual programs. So for instance, a national sovereign wealth fund, that could be capitalized partly from, carbon rebates. It could also be capitalized partly from VAT taxes and that sort of thing. But that is actually not the most interesting conversation to have. The most interesting conversation to have is, what are the reservoirs where universal high income comes from? And that is this graphic here. So transfers, to start to dig a little bit deeper into, like, what do we mean by transfers? What can we do? What are some examples? First is guaranteed income. So this is cash transfers where there's been lots and lots of pilots around America, and as well as in other nations and other cities around the world. So 100 plus US cities since 2020 have done $500 to $1,000 a month. Stockton seed recipients were more likely to find full-time employment than the control group. So when you break it down, instead of saying, okay, this has to come from the national budget exclusively, one thing that's really interesting is that guaranteed income pilots actually can start relatively small and local. So that's a very important point to keep in mind. You can also do state level supplements, so earned income tax credits or negative income tax. So 31 states plus DC and Puerto Rico operate their own earned income tax credits on top of the federal EITC. So this is another example as to where you can actually inject some of this, universal high income mechanisms at the state level rather than just at the federal level. Then auto enrollment retirement, so asset building, so state auto IRA programs. 19 states have enacted this, such as CalSavers and Oregon Saves. Participation rates jump from 5 to 15% to 70 to 90%. One of the key things here is this is technically not a transfer, but this is something that the state can do to make capital accumulation automatic. And making it automatic, making capital accumulation the default policy, is exactly the kind of thing that we need to do. Now, you might be saying, okay, this isn't going to save us because we're about to, go flying off the automation cliff, which is true. We should have been implementing all these things 30 years ago, and we'll get to that. I actually have calculated in like all of that. So just bear with me, just sit tight. And then public services in kind, so K through 12 education, public transit, and that sort of thing. Already mentioned that, so that is not something that really goes into your balance sheet as a household, but that's an example of a transfer, is education, public transit, and that sort of thing. One thing that I need to point out is that the U.S. already transfers $4 trillion a year to household. Much of it is called entitlement spending. So we already have a highly socialist country to the tune of $4 trillion per year. So when people say, oh, well, we shouldn't rely on the government, and that sounds like socialism or that sounds like communism, we're already doing that. And we're doing it with things like Social Security, Medicare, public education, Medicaid, and household assistance, EITC, SNAP benefits. That is a huge, huge amount of spending. So entitlement spending is a transfer. So whenever you hear someone talk about entitlements, those are transfers. That is simply a large-scale system of cash and in-kind services already in place. The COVID stimulus checks are an example of another basically direct UBI. So 3 rounds reached 160 million households at $867 billion total cost. That was a direct massive transfer program demonstrating the capability to distribute funds at scale. Now, that was a lot of money, and it was not sustainable at the time. That actually goes back to the fact that when we are looking at how do you replace wage-based income, you do not want to rely entirely on government spending. You want to boost capital. So then when we talk about how do you fund all of this, when we're talking about like, okay, how do you capitalize a sovereign wealth fund? How do you capitalize a state wealth fund? How do you even capitalize a municipal wealth fund? So there's value-added tax, so that's a VAT tax, which is very popular in Europe, corporate profit taxes, automation capital and service taxes, carbon taxes and dividends, wealth taxes, data and AI royalties, financial transaction tax, and then what's actually popular with a lot of you is land value tax. So the idea is that because income and payroll taxes account for 80 to 85% of all federal revenue, and that is wage dependent, we need to rip that out, which means we need to replace those payroll taxes with a bunch of other taxes, meaning that the entire government must pivot its entire tax revenue strategy. Fortunately, there are lots of other things that you can tax, and we didn't even talk about data center taxes and robot taxes. So the idea is that someone's got to pay the bill, and that someone isn't going to be people, working and paying out of their paycheck, which, feels kind of like theft anyways. So then when we talk about on the capital side, let's talk about what the cities themselves can own, because it's like, okay, some of you have said like, all right, well, it makes sense when you have a nation that has a lot of mineral rights, such as oil revenue. And actually someone asked about, what about like Africa? What about poor African nations? And in some cases, those poor African nations actually have a tremendous amount of mineral wealth in the form of stuff like cobalt. So they're actually in better shape than some states here in America. There are poor states, there are poor countries, and there are poor cities. So it's not necessarily going to be an easy thing to solve at all levels. But when you take a look globally, from the Bank of North Dakota to Copenhagen to Chattanooga to Singapore and Vienna, now granted most of these are Western, but Singapore isn't, there are all kinds of things that cities can do to capitalize their own sovereign wealth funds or their own municipal wealth funds. So if you hear me use the term endowment, sometimes I use that interchangeably because it functions no differently from like a university endowment. So a university endowment is a bunch of cash that they've been donated and that they've cultivated over time, and that they invest and they use that to help pay for some of the university. Likewise, cities with endowments, with urban endowments or urban wealth funds, can do the same thing. And there's different ways that they can be capitalized. So there's a state-owned bank. There is fiber, so monetizing public infrastructure. There's all kinds of different things that have been done all over the world. Now, state permanent wealth funds are also a very similar option. So there are actually 4 good examples here in America already. So we have the Alaska Permanent Fund, which is capitalized to the tune of $80 to $89 billion. And at present, or at least, as of 2022, it provides about $13,000 per family. So that reduces poverty by 20 to 40% with no negative employment tax since it's not 1862. Sorry, it's a little bit later. It's not that old. It was created in the 60s or 70s. So that was just a little fluke by the Notebook LM generating this for me. New Mexico State Investment Council. There we go. Distributions projected to surpass oil gas as leading revenue source by 2039. And this funds universal child care. So New Mexico is funded by land and oil. Then the Texas Permanent School Fund, also funded by oil to the tune of $48 billion, one of the oldest sovereign wealth funds globally, 1854. This one is genuinely very old. And then the North Dakota Legacy Fund, also by oil. So you see a common pattern there where if you do have oil rents that you can capture, but oil is not the only thing that you can capture. You can capture other mineral rights. You can capture things like sun. You can capture solar. You can capture spectrum and carbon and those sorts of things. But the point is that out of 50 states, only 4 American states have even created a permanent wealth fund so far. Then at the national level, there are quite a few national or sovereign wealth funds. So Norway has the largest in the world, which is their global pension fund. And then Abu Dhabi has another one. Now, of course, these are also mostly capitalized by oil as well. So then you have the GIC Temasek, in Singapore. Then you have the Saudi Arabian one, and then the Kuwaiti one. So these are examples to show that this model is reproducible. And as I said, oil rents are not the only one that you can capture. Now, this is where we get into the biggest problem is many of these have been around for a long time. The oldest sovereign wealth fund is the one in Kuwait that has been in service since 1953, or maybe it's 1963. Anyways, it's the oldest in the world, and it takes a while for these to become solvent. This is one of the biggest problems, and this is why America is actually way behind the curve. We're behind the Middle East, we're behind Europe, because we have not been focusing on building state wealth funds or urban wealth funds or sovereign wealth funds. So when you look at the math, we are the only major advanced economy without some kind of sovereign wealth fund. Now, Trump in February 2025 did order the creation of one. However, it'll take a while. So a U.S. fund capitalized at 3 to 5% of GDP per year, growing at 7% nominal returns, reaches $58 trillion in 25 to 30 years. At a 3% spending rule, that yields $14,000 per household in perpetual dividends. Now, I don't know about you, but 25 to 30 years is too darn long. We will not have the returns of the sovereign wealth fund when we need it, which is going to be probably between 2030 and 2035. So we've got, maybe 10 years, which means we will need a much thicker cushion. And this is what the simulation that I created shows, as well as the white paper up on GitHub. And I'll make sure that you have a link to those. But we will not be able to survive just on sovereign wealth dividends or state wealth dividends for a while yet. So we have already missed the bus. When we talk about broadening private ownership at the household level, so everything that we've talked about in terms of capital-based income has still been run by the government at some level, whether it's your local city, whether it's your local state, or your nation. However, what we do need to create is more on-ramps, making capital ownership the default option and making it automatic. So when we talk about universal on-ramps, here are some examples. Number one is ESOPs. So converting companies to ESOPs, which is an employee stock option plan or stock ownership plan. In America, there are 6,600 already with 15 million participants and $2 trillion in assets. Participants who work for an ESOP have 2 times the retirement savings and 2.3 times the net worth of people who do not participate in an ESOP. So making ESOPs more popular is one of the easiest and best things we can do in America to make wealth accumulation automatic. Employee ownership trusts are very similar in the UK. The growth has been 1,640% in a decade. Tax-free bonuses up to $3,600 a year. And what these do, so some of the stories behind the EOTs is imagine you have an owner of a company who is trying to retire. He's getting older and he doesn't want to pass it on to his children, or his children aren't interested or not qualified to run the company. So instead, what he can do, or what they can do is transfer the ownership of that company to the employees when they retire. And there's a lot of tax incentives to do it this way. And this is why EOTs have become very popular in the UK. So basically, this gives the owner who says, you know what, I spent decades building this, it gives them a golden parachute option, and then it transfers ownership to the employees. Baby bonds, so this is the federal Trump accounts that were created earlier, or I guess last year at this point, it's 2026. So the idea is that you will have, by the time someone gets to adulthood, they will have about $17,000 or maybe a little bit more, depending on how much it compounds. So this is an idea that basically says, as soon as you come of age, here's your endowment as an American citizen, and that can go towards a down payment of a house. It can go towards the down payment on a car. It can go towards education, or it can be folded into other kinds of wealth. So again, if you make wealth accumulation and capital accumulation the default, then that is what happens. And then we already talked about auto-enrolled accounts. Conventional capital, stocks, bonds, and real estate, we don't need to rehash that example. Other worker cooperatives and decentralized autonomous organizations or digital ownership. These are all other options to create more on-ramps so that capital accumulation is not only easy, it is automatic and the default option. This is really kind of what we're going for in the long run. So not only do you have guaranteed income and universal basic income and dividends from sovereign wealth funds and state wealth funds, you have something that you have control over. You have economic agency directly. I cannot emphasize this enough. Now, when we talk about the long term, this is really kind of what we're talking about in terms of what is the transition going to look like. So today, as of the latest data that we have is 2024, but it hasn't really changed much. Capital makes up 5% of household income, transfers are 13%, and wages are 82%. As wages go away, then something will need to expand to take that. So that would be some more capital, some more transfers, and then of course the wages shrink. And then in the long run, the goal should be so that basically wages and capital flip-flop. We would ideally see capital-based income in the 2050s to be greater than 80%. Honestly, I would say greater than 90% of household income, with a little bit of transfers and a little bit of wages as residual. That's what I would prefer to see. That's why I set this to greater than 60%. I don't know if we can actually get there, but if most households are getting most of their money from capital, from all the different kinds of capital that we've talked about, whether it's public capital or private capital, that is going to be much more stable in the long run. And that also means that household income grows with the economy, meaning that your interests are then intrinsically aligned with the interests of the government and the billionaires, because everyone wants the economy to grow. As of right now, with labor share of income declining, you're getting left behind. With GDP decoupling from wages, you're getting left behind. But if everyone has a massive stake in the economy, then everyone that is truly not like trickle-down economics. That is truly a paradigm where the rising tide lifts all boats, or in this case, all households. You know what I mean? So every year we wait costs exponentially more than the year before. This is the chasm that we need to cross. So capital will take many years to ramp up, whether it is household capital or sovereign capital or that sort of thing. Wages, however, are going to fall off a cliff before then, meaning we have this entire gap, this grayed out area that we need to fill. And backfilling that can only be done with transfers, because remember, there's three sources of household income: wages, capital, and transfers. So wages are going to be going away. That's just, yes, we could pass laws to ban AI usage and just keep people doing bullshit jobs for the sake of doing bullshit jobs. But that's not economically efficient, and it's also really dehumanizing. And a lot of people don't want those jobs anyways. So wages are going away. Capital, we can build. The numbers check out. If we were to stack all of these interventions together, from public capital and private capital, at the household level, at the city level, at the state level, and at the federal level, we can absolutely end up in a situation where capital returns fund every household. The problem is time. The problem is that we're late to the game. America, and really every other nation, should have been building public wealth and private wealth for decades. We should have started in the 60s or 70s. Then, instead of having to wait until the 2050s and 2060s for it to fully mature, we're going to have to use universal basic income, guaranteed income, and those sorts of things as a stopgap measure in order to keep the economy chugging along. Otherwise, it's just not going to happen. So that is it for this presentation. Now let me show you the actual GitHub repo where you can look at all of this in greater detail. All right, here's our white paper. So the white paper is nice and structured, and it includes everything that we've gone over in much greater detail, including the outcomes of the simulations. But one thing that I want to include or really draw your attention to is the survey that I did of all every single intervention that's out there. So, and this isn't even all of them. This is just the top of them. So global inventory of post-labor income interventions. So we've got transfer programs. So everything from dividends and Social Security to public capital, so government pension funds, China Investment Corporation, and then private capital programs such as ESOPs and more. So this is more than 140 interventions from around the world that can all contribute to creating a universal high income for literally everyone. Now, one of the things that I found in these simulations, and I've got it all covered in this white paper, is the fact that we do not have enough time to capitalize all of this. However, in the long run, the median household income in America could go as high as $500,000 in today's dollars. One of the things that I did not explain in greater detail is that there's a couple other reasons driving this. So one is demonetization, and then another is deflation. So demonetization is a transaction that just goes away. A lot of people have started realizing that GDP is not really the best measurement in the future, because when you have one tool that obviates a lot of other spending, so say for instance, your AI chatbot, just today, it can already do artwork for you, it can do law for you, it can do medicine for you. So a lot of that is transactions that just never happen. So that is demonetization. And then deflation is the cost of stuff that you need that becomes much cheaper. So the cost of pretty much all digital goods and services can go down by a factor of 100 to 100,000. So that's deflation. And that is actually baked into the simulator if you want to go play with it. So yeah, with all that being said, please take a look at this and spread the word. My book is coming out soon, so let me show you a little bit about that. All right, and finally, Labor Zero, a post-labor economics treatise. This is my book, 180,000 words that covers all of this in much, much greater detail. We have 19 days to go at time of recording. We have almost 1,000 backers. If you want to get in on this and help make this happen, please do so. There are plenty of tiers left to join. And yeah, so we got the projects we love on Kickstarter. So we made it to the front page, the trending section of Kickstarter. Yeah, so there you have it. That is how I would build universal high income. There is nothing in this that is magic. We don't need to overhaul the entire system. It's just going to take a matter of time and political effort. If you've been following me on Substack or Twitter, I've been posting a series of articles making the argument for post-labor economics from different perspectives, like the progressive view, the conservative view, and even the capitalist view. And then I'm going to be releasing this video alongside here's how we actually build universal high income. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you all on the other side.